Sarah Vaughn no longer had a body, she was aware of this in a distant way, like remembering a dream from childhood. She had once been a woman with hands and eyes and a heart that beat in her chest. She had once breathed air and felt warmth and known the weight of gravity pulling her down. All of that was gone now. All that remained was essence. Soul. The pure spark of consciousness that the Imperium called the most valuable resource in the galaxy. She was one thread among billions. The tapestry of the Astronomicon stretched around her in every direction, a web of suffering that spanned the Imperium itself. Each thread was a soul that had been sacrificed to the Golden Throne. Each thread burned with agony that never ended. And together, they created the light that guided humanity through the darkness of the warp. Sarah could feel the other souls around her. Some had been here for days. Some had been here for years. A few had been burning since the earliest days of the Imperium, their consciousness stretched so thin that they no longer remembered what they had been. They were just pain now. Just light. Just fuel. This was what waited for her. This was her eternity. The Emperor's presence filled everything. He was the center of the web, the source of the power that kept the Astronomicon burning. His will held everything together. His consciousness touched every soul that fed the machine. He knew each of them. He felt each of them. He shared their suffering because he had no choice. Sarah felt his attention on her again. It was gentler now, softer than before. The Emperor could not speak in words that her fading consciousness could understand. But he could share feelings. He could share memories. He could show her things that no one else would ever see. He showed her what he had wanted the Imperium to become. Sarah saw cities of light where humans lived in peace. She saw scholars studying the mysteries of the universe without fear of the Inquisition. She saw children growing up without the shadow of war hanging over them. She saw a humanity that had conquered the stars and found wisdom instead of more reasons to fight. This was the dream. This was what the Emperor had sacrificed everything to build. Then he showed her what the Imperium had actually become. Sarah saw endless war across 1,000,000 worlds. She saw the Inquisition burning innocents in his name. She saw the ecclesiarchy building cathedrals while billions starved. She saw space marines who had forgotten why they fought. She saw a civilization that had replaced hope with hate and understanding with violence. The Emperor had not wanted any of this. Every prayer that praised his divinity was a knife in his soul. Every sacrifice that fueled his throne was a reminder of how completely his plans had failed. He had tried to free humanity from the darkness. Instead, he had become the darkness, and yet he endured. Sarah felt the iron will that kept the Emperor functioning even after 10,000 years of torment. He could have given up. He could have let himself fade. The throne would have failed. The Astronomicon would have gone dark. Humanity would have been lost to the warp. But he refused. And no matter how much he suffered, no matter how badly his children had twisted his legacy, the Emperor would not abandon them. He loved humanity too much to let it die. So he sat on his broken throne, screaming in eternal silence, holding back the darkness for a species that no longer understood what he had tried to give them. The Emperor did not protect, the Emperor endured. Sarah understood now. She understood why the sacrifices were necessary. She understood why the throne had to be fed. She understood the terrible truth at the heart of the Imperium: humanity was too broken to save itself. It needed the Emperor. It needed the light of the Astronomicon. It needed the sacrifice of 1,000 souls every single day just to survive. Without the Golden Throne, ships would be lost in the warp. Communication would fail. The Imperium would shatter into 1,000,000,000 isolated pieces, each one easy prey for the horrors that waited in the darkness. The sacrifice was the only thing keeping humanity alive, and Sarah was part of it now. She felt herself dissolving further into the Astronomicon. Her memories began to blur and fade. The face of her brother grew distant, like a star retreating into space. Her name became just a sound, then just an idea, then nothing at all. But before the last of her consciousness faded, she felt something unexpected: gratitude, not from the Emperor. Not from the Imperium. But from something vast and ancient that existed beyond both. The souls of the Astronomicon had become something more than the sum of their parts. They had become a single entity, a beacon of light in the endless night. And in that light, there was a strange kind of peace. Sarah had spent her whole life working in a factory, making bullets that would kill people she would never meet. She had lived in poverty and fear and quiet desperation. She had never done anything that mattered. She had never been anyone special, but now she was part of something eternal. Her suffering would guide ships across the galaxy. Her pain would keep humanity alive. She had become more important in death than she ever could have been in life. That it was not comfort. It was not justice. But it was meaning, and meaning was more than most people ever found. Sarah Vaughn dissolved into the Astronomicon. Her essence joined the countless others who had come before, becoming light, becoming guide, becoming sacrifice. Her agony would continue for as long as the throne required. But somewhere deep in that suffering, a tiny spark of her remembered that she had mattered. Far away, on a hive world called Trantis Majoris, a young man received a notification on his data slate. A priest stood at his door, speaking of honor and glory and eternal service. His family wept with what the ecclesiarchy called joy. Another name had been drawn, another sacrifice was coming. The throne required 1,000 souls every day. And somewhere in the depths of the imperial palace, where the light of the Astronomicon burned bright enough to guide all of humanity, what remained of Sarah Vaughn added her voice to the chorus of the damned. The emperor endured, and so, in their own small and terrible way, did his sacrifices. Pain was too simple a word for what happened next. The device entered Sarah's spine at the base of her skull. She felt it pierce through bone and muscle, through nerves and tissue, through things that had no names in any human language. The tech priest worked with the careful precision of a craftsman, threading wires and tubes into places where nothing should ever reach. Sarah tried to scream. Her mouth opened. Her lungs pushed air. But no sound came out. The Sister of Silence stood nearby, her null field swallowing every cry before it could exist. The silence was absolute. The pain was absolute. And there was nothing to do but endure. They moved her while she was still conscious. She felt hands lifting her table, rolling it through corridors that stretched and twisted in ways that made no sense. The ceiling above changed from metal to stone to something that might have been organic. The lights flickered between colors that her eyes could not properly see, and then she entered the throne room. No human language contained words for what Sarah saw. The golden throne was not golden. That was the first truth she understood. It had never been golden. The name was a lie, like so many things in the Imperium. The throne was every color that light could be and several colors that light should never be. It pulsed with energy that existed between dimensions, a machine built by science so advanced that it looked like magic, and upon the throne sat the emperor. The word sat was wrong. The emperor did not sit. He was fused to the throne. He was part of the throne. The distinction between the machine and the man had dissolved 10,000 years ago when his body was broken and his soul was bound to this device. What remained was neither alive nor dead. It was something else entirely. Sarah could see his face. She wished she could not. The emperor had once been the most beautiful being in the galaxy. Records and paintings showed him as perfect, radiant, a god made flesh. But that was before Horus. That was before the wound that never healed. That was before 10,000 years of decay held back only by technology and sacrifice. His face was a skull stretched with paper-thin skin. His eyes were empty sockets that somehow still saw everything. His mouth was open in an eternal scream that made no sound. Cables and tubes pierced every part of his body, feeding him power, draining his essence, keeping him trapped in a state between life and death that no soul should ever endure. The throne room was massive. It stretched for miles in every direction, filled with machines and servitors and the bodies of those who had come before Sarah. Thousands of sacrifices hung from the ceiling, connected to the throne by wires that glowed with stolen life. Some of them were still moving. Some of them were still screaming without sound. They would remain that way for days. Weeks. However long the process required, Sarah was lifted into position among them. A mechanical arm grabbed her table and raised it high above the floor. She could see the other sacrifices now, their faces frozen in expressions of horror that would never change. She could see Corvus somewhere in the distance, his soldier's composure finally broken, his mouth open in a silent cry. The connection happened without warning. One moment she was herself, a young woman from a hive world who had worked in a factory and loved her family and dreamed small dreams. The next moment she was something else entirely. She was a thread in a tapestry of suffering that stretched across time and space. She was one of billions who had died here, whose souls had been consumed to keep the Emperor alive, and she could feel him. The Emperor's consciousness brushed against hers like a sun touching a candle flame. He was vast beyond understanding, a mind that had lived for tens of thousands of years and experienced things that no human could comprehend. He had walked among gods and defeated them. He had built an empire that spanned the stars. He had loved humanity with a love so deep that he had sacrificed everything for its survival, and he was screaming. The Emperor was in agony. Every moment of every day for 10,000 years, he had experienced pain beyond imagination. The throne tore at his soul. The sacrifices burned through him like acid. The prayers of trillions of faithful worshippers struck his consciousness like hammers, each one a reminder of how badly his plans had failed. That he had never wanted this. Sarah understood that now with perfect clarity. The Emperor had never wanted to be a god. He had built the Imperium to free humanity from superstition and worship. He had forbidden his sons from treating him as divine. He had planned a future where humanity would stand on its own, without the crutch of religion, but Horus had betrayed him. The wound had been struck. The throne had become his prison. And in the 10,000 years since, everything he had fought against had come to pass. The Imperium worshipped him as a god. The ecclesiarchy demanded prayer and sacrifice. The very religion he had banned now kept him alive through methods he would have found horrifying. He was sustained by the thing he hated most, and he could not die. The throne would not let him die. The tech priests would not let him die. The entire Imperium would collapse if he died, and so he was forced to endure eternal torment for a species that no longer understood what he had tried to give them. Sarah felt his attention focus on her for just an instant. In that moment, she saw everything he was. She saw his love for humanity. She saw his despair at what they had become. She saw his rage and his sorrow and his endless, unbreakable will. She saw a god who prayed every day for death and was denied. Then the machines pulled harder on her soul, and she began to dissolve. The Eternity Gate was the largest door Sarah had ever seen. It rose higher than the tallest spires of her home hive, carved from materials that no longer existed anywhere in the galaxy. Skulls decorated every surface. Thousands of them. Millions of them. The skulls of martyrs and saints, the skulls of traitors and heretics, all bound together in gold and stone to guard the entrance to the most sacred place in the Imperium. Sarah walked in a line of 50 sacrifices. They moved in silence through a corridor so wide that entire armies could march through it. The ceiling disappeared into shadow far above. The walls were covered in carvings that told the history of humanity, 10,000 years of war and suffering rendered in perfect detail. She noticed something strange about the carvings. The older ones, from the earliest days of the Imperium, showed people in pain. Their faces twisted in agony. Their mouths open in screams. The artists had not hidden the truth of what happened here, but the newer carvings were different. The figures smiled. They raised their hands in joy. They looked grateful for the honor of dying. Somewhere along the line, someone had decided that the truth was too ugly to show. Custodians stood along the corridor like golden statues. They were the personal guardians of the Emperor, warriors who made even space marines seem small. Each one wore armor that had been crafted 10,000 years ago, decorated with jewels and symbols of ancient power. They did not move. They did not breathe. They might have been statues, or they might have been corpses standing upright, preserved forever in their duty. Sarah could not tell. On Terra, the line between the living and the dead seemed very thin. A sister of silence led her group deeper into the palace. The woman wore silver armor and carried a sword longer than Sarah was tall. She was a blank, a person born without any connection to the warp. Her very presence made Sarah's thoughts feel wrong, like insects crawling behind her eyes, desperate to escape. The Sisters of Silence could not speak. They had taken vows of eternal quiet. But their silence was more than just an absence of words. It was a weapon, a null field that smothered psychic power like water smothered fire. The sacrifices were not allowed to speak either. Guards had made that clear before they entered the palace. Any sound would be punished. So they walked in perfect quiet, their footsteps the only noise in the ancient halls. The floor was worn smooth in places. Sarah looked down and realized that countless feet had walked this exact path before her. Billions of sacrifices over 10,000 years. Each one had taken these same steps. Each one had breathed this same recycled air. Each one had looked at these same carvings and wondered what waited at the end. They passed a doorway that led to a massive chamber. Sarah caught only a glimpse before they moved on, but what she saw burned itself into her memory. Servitors worked inside the chamber. They were cleaning blood from the walls and floor. The servitors moved with mechanical efficiency, their human bodies merged with machines that controlled every action. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty. Sarah recognized some of those faces. They looked like the sacrifices she had traveled with on the Black Ship. She understood then what happened to those who did not survive the process but did not die completely. They were recycled. Their bodies were made useful. Their minds were erased and replaced with simple programming. They would serve the throne forever, cleaning up the mess left by those who came after them. The Sister of Silence noticed Sarah looking. The woman turned her head slightly, and though she had no expression on her face, Sarah felt the warning clearly. Do not look. Do not think. Do not ask questions. Sarah looked at the floor and kept walking. The final preparation chamber was cold. White lights glared from the ceiling, so bright that Sarah had to squint. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus waited for them there, their bodies more machine than flesh. Red robes covered limbs of metal and wire. Faces that had once been human now featured only sensors and breathing tubes. One of the tech priests was whistling. The sound was so unexpected that Sarah almost laughed. It was a hymn she recognized from her childhood, a simple song about the Emperor's love that mothers sang to their children. The tech priest whistled it while preparing instruments that would pierce flesh and soul. That he did not seem to notice the contradiction. The sacrifices were separated into smaller groups. Sarah found herself with 9 others, all strangers, all silent, all terrified. They were led to metal tables that waited in neat rows. The tables had restraints for arms and legs. They had drains beneath them to catch whatever might spill. A tech priest approached Sarah. In his mechanical hands, he carried something that looked like it had been designed to open souls. Metal and crystal formed a device that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3. When Sarah looked directly at it, her eyes watered. When she looked away, she could still see it in the corner of her vision. The tech priest spoke in a voice made of static and harmonics. He explained that the process would begin shortly. He explained that her sacrifice would power the Astronomicon and guide humanity through the stars. He explained that she should feel honored. He did not explain that it would hurt. He did not need to. Sarah was strapped to the table. The metal was cold against her back. Above her, she could see the ceiling covered in cables and tubes that stretched away into darkness. Somewhere beyond that darkness was the throne room. Somewhere beyond that was the Emperor. She was so close now. The tech priest raised his device. The whistling had stopped. The only sound was the hum of machines warming up. Sarah closed her eyes and thought of her brother's face. It was the last peaceful thought she would ever have. The ship was called Torment's Grace. Sarah learned this from a metal plate bolted to the wall of the holding chamber. She did not know if the name was meant to be ironic or if the Imperium simply did not understand what those words meant when placed together. 400 people filled the chamber. They sat on cold metal floors or leaned against walls that hummed with strange energy. There were no beds. There were no windows. There was only darkness broken by the dim red glow of emergency lights that never turned off. The ship had taken them from Trantis Majoris 3 days ago. At least Sarah thought it was 3 days. Time moved strangely here. Sometimes an hour felt like a minute. Sometimes a minute stretched into what felt like years. The ship traveled through the warp, that hellish dimension where the normal rules of reality did not apply. Sarah could feel the warp pressing against the hull. It was not a physical sensation. It was something deeper, something that touched the part of her that dreamed and feared and hoped. The warp wanted in. The ship's shields kept it out. But nothing could keep out the whispers. The walls whispered constantly. Most of the time the sounds were too quiet to understand. But sometimes, usually when Sarah was close to sleep, the whispers formed words. They promised things. They threatened things. They spoke her name in voices that sounded almost like her mother. She learned not to listen. The crew of the black ship moved among the sacrifices without speaking. They were members of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the organization that hunted and controlled psychers throughout the Imperium. Their eyes had been removed and replaced with green glowing sensors. Their mouths had been sealed shut with metal plates. They communicated through hand signals and data transmissions. They did not need to speak to the cargo they carried. That was what Sarah and the others were now. Cargo. Fuel for the Golden Throne. On the second day, a man sat down beside Sarah. He was older than her, perhaps 40 years, with gray in his short hair and scars on his face. He wore the tattered remains of an Imperial Guard uniform, the regiment markings torn away but the fabric still recognizable. He introduced himself as Corvus. He had been a soldier for 20 years. He had fought against orcs on jungle worlds and chaos cultists in frozen wastelands. He had survived battles that killed everyone else in his unit. He had been promoted 3 times and demoted twice. He had seen a space marine once, an actual angel of death in blue armor, and the sight had made him believe in the Emperor with all his heart. Then he came home. The lottery had selected him on his first day back on his homeworld. 20 years of service meant nothing. His medals meant nothing. His faith meant nothing. He was just another name in the system, another soul to be fed to the machine that kept the Imperium alive. Corvus told Sarah that he used to pray every night. He used to believe that the Emperor watched over his faithful servants. He used to think that sacrifice and duty would be rewarded in the end. Now he did not know what he believed. Sarah asked him if he was afraid. He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. He said that fear was for people who had something to lose. He had already lost everything the moment his name was drawn. What remained was not fear. It was simply waiting. On the third day, a woman in the corner of the chamber began to laugh. The sound started small, almost like crying. Then it grew louder and louder until it echoed off the metal walls. The woman could not stop. She laughed until her voice broke. She laughed until blood came from her throat. She laughed at something that only she could see. The silent crew came for her. They moved without hurry, their green eye sensors glowing in the darkness. They lifted the woman by her arms and carried her through a door that Sarah had not noticed before. The door closed behind them. The woman did not come back. No one spoke about what had happened. No one asked where she had been taken. Everyone understood that some questions were better left unasked. The warp did things to people. The journey broke minds that were not strong enough. Those who broke were removed. Sarah wondered if they were killed or simply stored somewhere else. She decided she did not want to know. On the 4th day, a voice came through speakers hidden in the ceiling. It was the first human voice Sarah had heard from the crew. The voice was flat and mechanical, probably generated by a servitor rather than a living person. The voice announced their approach to Holy Terra. Sarah found a small viewport in one corner of the chamber. She had to push through dozens of other sacrifices who wanted to see the same thing. When she finally pressed her face to the cold glass, her breath caught in her throat. Terra hung in the void like a diseased jewel. The planet was covered entirely in metal and stone. No green remained. No blue oceans reflected the light of the sun. The entire world was one massive city, layer upon layer of buildings stacked miles high, home to uncountable billions who lived and died in service to the Imperium, and at the heart of it all, barely visible even from orbit, sat the Imperial Palace. The structure was larger than continents. Its spires reached into space itself. Somewhere inside those impossible walls was the Golden Throne. Somewhere in there, Sarah would die. Corvus stood beside her at the viewport. He stared at Terra with eyes that held no wonder, only resignation. He had dreamed of seeing the throne world his entire life. Every faithful citizen of the Imperium dreamed of it. Now he was here, and the dream had become a nightmare. He asked Sarah if she thought it would hurt. She did not answer. She did not have to. They both knew the truth. The ship began its descent toward the world that would consume them. The knock came at the 7th hour of the work cycle. Sarah Vaughn was eating thin soup with her family when the sound echoed through their small hab unit. Her father stopped moving. Her mother dropped her spoon. Even her younger brother Malik, who was only 9 years old, understood that certain knocks meant certain things. No one knocked on doors in Hive Trantis unless they brought either death or taxes. Sometimes both. Her father opened the door. A priest of the ecclesiarchy stood there in robes of deep red and gold. Behind him waited 2 soldiers in black armor, their faces hidden behind helmets that showed nothing human. The priest smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who believed he was doing holy work. He spoke the words that ended Sarah's life. She had been chosen. The lottery had selected her name from the billions who lived and worked and died on this world. She would travel to holy Terra itself. She would stand before the golden throne. She would give her life to sustain the emperor of mankind. The priest called it an honor beyond measure. Sarah felt her legs go weak. She grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. Her mother made a sound that was not quite human. Her father stood completely still, as if he had been turned to stone by the words. The priest continued speaking. He talked about glory. He talked about eternal service. He talked about how Sarah's soul would join the Emperor's light and burn forever in his radiance. He made it sound beautiful. Sarah had heard the stories that the priests did not tell. Everyone in the Underhive had heard them. The black ships came and took the chosen ones away. They were never seen again. The official teaching said they lived forever at the Emperor's side. The whispers in dark corners said something very different. The whispers spoke of screaming that never stopped. Her father finally moved. He bowed low to the priest and spoke the required words of gratitude. His voice shook, but he said them correctly. To refuse the honor would mean death for the entire family. To show anything but joy would bring the attention of the Inquisition. So he thanked the priest for choosing his daughter to die. The priest nodded with satisfaction. He handed over a data slate that contained instructions for Sarah's collection. She had 72 hours. She was to report to the Cathedral of the Emperor's Mercy at dawn on the 3rd day. She was to bring nothing with her. She would need nothing where she was going. After the priest left, no one spoke for a long time. Sarah looked at her hands. They were the hands of a factory worker, rough and scarred from years of labor. She was 23 years old. She had worked in the ammunition factory since she was 12. She had never seen the sky without the brown haze of pollution. She had never tasted food that was not recycled from the waste of the upper hives. She had never known anything but work and survival and the distant hope that tomorrow might be slightly less terrible than today. Now there would be no tomorrow. Her mother began to cry. The sound was quiet at first, then grew louder until it filled the small room. Her father put his arm around her mother but said nothing. What words could he possibly say? Malik looked at Sarah with confusion in his young eyes. He did not fully understand what had happened. He only knew that his sister was leaving and that everyone was sad. That he asked why she could not simply hide. The question hung in the air like poison. Hide. Such a simple word. Such an impossible idea. The Imperium had eyes everywhere. The priests had lists of every citizen. The soldiers had orders to hunt down anyone who tried to escape their sacred duty. Those who ran were caught. Those who were caught died slowly, along with everyone they loved. Sarah knelt down and hugged her brother. She told him that she was going somewhere important. She told him that he needed to be brave and take care of their parents. She told him that she would always love him. She did not tell him that she was afraid. That night, after everyone else had gone to their sleeping mats, Sarah stood by the small window of their hab unit. The view showed only the grey walls of other buildings, the endless maze of the underhive where millions lived their short and difficult lives. But if she pressed her face to the glass and looked up, she could see the distant spires of the cathedral. The priest said that thousands volunteered for this honor every day. They said that the chosen ones walked gladly to their fate, singing hymns of praise. They said that the lottery existed only to be fair, to give everyone an equal chance at such glory. Sarah looked at the streets below. They were empty except for rats and shadows. No one walked toward the cathedral with joy in their heart. No one volunteered for what waited there. The lottery existed because it had to exist. The emperor required 1,000 souls every day. 1,000 people had to die so that he could continue to live. The math was simple and terrible. In a galaxy of trillions, 1,000 per day was nothing. A rounding error. A small price for the survival of humanity, unless you were one of the 1,000. Sarah watched the cathedral spires until her eyes burned. Somewhere in there, priests were preparing for her arrival. Somewhere beyond the stars, the black ships were coming. Somewhere on Holy Terra, the golden throne waited for her soul. She had 72 hours left. She intended to feel every single one of them.